USP, US Gov, Unit 2 test review, looking at the interactions amongst branches. Very important for concept application question. Also looking at different branches and their functions for the argumentative, and looking at the key maybe court cases or documents that they address there. Some of the key terms that we'll kind of go over before we get into the branches, different things that we'll highlight: Bully Pulpit, the idea of a divided government, gerrymandering, Logrolling, different rules in the different houses, and we'll address the judicial branch as well. So looking at first branch, legislative branch, Congress, the first thing to kind of bring up here is the idea of reapportionment and gerrymandering. So the idea that every 10 years there's a census, and the census then will reapportion the amount of seats in the House of Reps. This affects electoral college as well. So some states, they lose population, they might lose a seat, which then makes their districts look a little bit different, which leads to redistricting. So redistricting is redrawing of those lines, and this is sometimes done by gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is the idea that they're drawing these districts lines, usually done by state legislatures, drawing those lines based on party. Okay, and they cannot do this though based on race. So there are a couple key court cases that address gerrymandering. Is Baker v. Carr. That's the first one. And in Tennessee, they had these districts that were very different in size as far as population. So the phrase "one man, one vote" comes up. Each district should have similar amount of votes based on population. Then Shaw v. Reno comes up. This is in North Carolina. It created 3 majority-minority districts when the U.S. Attorney General sued the state for creating one district that was gerrymandered, ensuring that a black candidate would win. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was used to challenge how the districts were created. So the question really is whether the Voting Rights Act of 65 and Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment mandated that legislative redistricting must use race as one of the factors to ensure minority representation. And in that decision, the Supreme Court reversed the lower court decision, describing the shape of the new district as really bizarre. And it was kind of bears uncomfortable resemblance of political apartheid, so kind of splitting things up. The court found that if a redistricting map is so bizarre on its face, unexplainable on the grounds other than race, that it cannot be used. So race can be a factor, but not the only factor. Looking at then policy making of Congress, the idea of making bills, ideas, and then trying to get those bills to become law. So there's different ways to do that in the different houses. There's different rules based on size, but the goal for both houses is to get these ideas, these bills, and create laws. Obviously, throughout that process, the president can play a role by veto, but Congress is trying their best, Congress people trying their best to get these laws passed. One way they can do that is the idea of Logrolling, basically saying, I'll vote for your piece of legislation if you vote for mine, so they're working with each other. The other way we've talked about is pork barrel legislation. Pork barrel deals legislation that only favors a small number of people, so basically maybe one representative for their constituents, but they attach it to other bills like appropriations bills to get something for their constituents. Say here, I am doing something for you. But that also helps bills get passed because then they'll vote for it. Then looking at the committee system. So going through bills and creating bills, they always start in committees. And that first committee would be a standing committee. The work is done there. A lot of times the bills then die there in committee. These standing committees are permanent, okay, and they're in both houses. There's also joint committees made up of members of both houses, maybe for a specific purpose. They're not permanent. Maybe it's an investigation or a special study. Then there's conference committees. Those are kind of to fix what differences they have on a specific bill, so that they can pass that bill and make it a law. Again, there's also different committees that are more important than others, like the House Ways and Means or the Judiciary Committee. Also, there's a Rules Committee that could be very important in each house. Other structures that you might want to talk about with Congress is the idea that there's a minority and majority party, and there's leaders of both. And under those leaders, there's people that are called whips or assistants. And what they're trying to do is kind of look at their party and make sure people are following what the party believes in, getting a feeling of how people would vote so that they can pass legislation. The differences then when passing legislation in the House and the Senate, different rules, the idea that the Senate has the filibuster. They can delay it by just speaking on the floor in need of 60 senators to cut it off, which is called a cloture. However, they also have the nuclear option, so change the rules. You just need a simple majority to stop presidential appointments other than Supreme Court justices. So it's a little easier for the majority party to stop that filibuster, but just a different way to kind of check each other when discussing legislation in the Senate. Also, a built-in check in the Senate. Senate must approve of all treaties by 2/3 vote that the president is trying to sign. Different ways that Congress people kind of act then. Once elected, there's 3 different models. The trustee model would be basically trusting in the politician. The people vote for me, and then me as the politician, I have the trust in the people to make my decisions and vote how I would like. Then there's the delegate model, meaning voting how your constituents want you to vote when voting for legislation. And then there's the political model, which is kind of a combination of both. Gridlock maybe discuss concept application type stuff. Gridlock has occurred a lot over the last few years, and this has resulted in maybe very inefficient Congress, but the idea that they're not working together, not compromising, so things are not getting done. There's also the idea of a divided government where a president is of one party and both houses may be controlled by the other party. And this is kind of then where a president has a platform and an agenda and can't get anything done. So maybe becomes a lame duck, as they call it, earlier than they wanted to. So that would mean that the president has all these ideas but knows nothing can get accomplished because Congress won't approve of their agenda or platform. All right, then looking at the presidency now. The express powers are there, but there are other duties and roles that we'll get to as far as pushing an agenda, a legislative agenda, being the head of the party, chief of the state, or chief diplomat. One of the big powers that the president has, being able to check on the legislative branch, is the veto power, or the pocket veto. Pocket veto is not used often, but it's the idea that can just let it sit there, not even veto it, knowing that Congress would adjourn within 10 days, and then the bill would die. Presidential appointments are huge for the president, but also can be checked by the Senate, so they must be approved by the Senate. Line item veto is something that the president cannot do, so we're not going to really talk about that. But other powers that the president has is the party leader. Because they are voted in as the president, they are the most important member of that party. They are looked at as a leader of the party, and they're going to kind of guide where the party goes. Another power that the president can use is the executive privilege. It allows the ability of the president to protect personal material and discussions that the president has. However, you cannot use it when you're in some type of federal investigation. And then the required document that is important to understand is Federalist 70. So when trying to pass the Constitution, Hamilton kind of looks at the executive department and says, you know what, we need a unitary president. We need only one person to be in charge of the executive branch for the idea that the president should be accountable, that one person will allow it to have purpose and direction and avoid conflict with other people. So it wouldn't be a large group where discussions and decisions would be made, but decisions could be made quickly. Looking then under the president is the cabinet and the White House staff. Your cabinet are 15 members that are approved by the Senate, appointed by the president, and they are controlling very large departments. They are like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Transportation, and they have a lot of people working underneath them. Now, the other group of individuals is the White House staff. Now, this staff is not approved by the Senate. So these are individuals who are not elected and not approved by the Senate. They are appointed by the president, and they advise the president. So these individuals could be making very key policy decisions. Chief of Staff is always talking with the president and advising and helping make decisions. The First Lady could be part of this as well and helping make different programs and decisions, and these people are not elected or approved by the Senate. One of the things that gets brought up a lot on AP tests is the War Powers Act, so the the back and forth between Congress and the president's role as commander-in-chief, and Congress's role or ability to go to war. The president can put troops in harm's way. However, if they do commit the military, usually should be after declaration of Congress of war, or declaration of war by Congress, or if he does or she does send troops in, the president must inform Congress within 48 hours and must stop if Congress does not want this to go on within 60 days. One of the things Congress has over the president is that they control the funds as well to the military. And then an idea looking at the Supreme Court, president always must have approval of senators of the different judges that the president would put up for all these different federal judge positions. One concept you could maybe possibly talk about as well is the Bully Pulpit that the president used. So this platform the president has to advance the policies and communicate with the American people. You say it out in the public, might push other individuals within government to get things done, whether it's your foreign policy, managing crisis, legislation, the agenda, the budget, different judges or appointments that you're trying to make. And it's easier today rather than just being able to have a press conference or access to the media. You have your own social media, and the president can bypass all those things and kind of just tweet out or put on a social media platform different things to persuade constituents, and then also kind of force other portions of the government to act. Then looking at the judicial branch, a couple key documents in Supreme Court cases. You have Federalist 78, and this talks about the independent judicial branch and the importance of it, where justices are appointed for life and that justices have the power of judicial review. Okay, so this kind of frees the justices from political pressure, whether it's campaigning or money, and they can kind of just interpret the Constitution the way that they believe is necessary. Also, the Supreme Court case that introduces the idea of judicial review is Marbury v. Madison. And this is the idea that the question was, can the Supreme Court declare a legislative act unconstitutional because it's a requirement to bring the case to the Supreme Court using the original jurisdiction doctrine? And they said yes. The landmark decision established this. So from this point on, 1803, judicial review was used much more. Kind of the process and how judicial branch kind of exercises their power. So cases are appealed all the time, and they are sometimes reach the level of the Supreme Court, and the only way the Supreme Court will hear a case is if 4 justices agree to. So that's the rule of 4, and they put it on the docket. Then there's tapes, or there's arguments that are made, and they kind of go back and forth. The process for a writ of cert to be heard is based on different criteria. So will they hear this case and actually have oral arguments? So is there any conflicts with precedent and things like that? So if it gets that far and the writ is granted, then it's all the documents and things from lower courts are sent to the Supreme Court. Both sides will prepare their argument. People outside the court will have briefs as well. So not only do the lawyers of each side have briefs outlining their positions, but individuals outside, so amicus curiae briefs, will be written to support different sides. This could be interest groups and individuals that are doing this. They hear both sides' arguments of the case. Then the justices meet in conference and they vote on it. Once a decision is made, that is called the majority decision, and the people that don't agree with it, they write the dissenting opinion. So both sides have to write their opinions to discuss why they chose or voted in one way. There also is a concurring opinion that agrees with the majority opinion, but for some different reasons. And then we look at kind of the idea how this can become partisan a little bit. Sometimes it becomes partisan when appointing justices, and they're looking at whether the justice is a judicial activist or votes on or kind of interprets the Constitution with judicial restraint. Judicial restraint maintains the status quo, looks at what other branches have established as the current policy, versus judicial restraint is kind of looking at different decisions and plowing new ground, establishing new precedents that will force different actions by the legislative branch. All right, now your fourth branch, in a sense, is your bureaucracy. So your functions of the bureaucracy, these are the workers that maybe have to pass some type of civil service requirement and test, and then they get the job. They serve there for a long time. They specialize in the job, and they have to follow the Constitution and rules, laws, and regulations. So that's kind of the way that they are held accountable. They have to follow their superiors, follow the federal laws, act in the interest of the public. So there's agencies and administrators that run governmental bodies. There's commissions that regulate different things, and there's corporations that are running programs and sometimes trying to make money. So how do they relate to other branches? This is, like I said, sometimes known as the fourth branch. They're linked to the president by appointment. They're directed by Congress. Congress oversees them with Congressional Oversight. But for the most part, they're part of the executive branch. Again, that's because usually the heads of their departments are appointed by the president. If there's an executive order, they have to follow it. They must abide by it, even if they don't agree with it. And that leads us to kind of the iron triangle then. Relationship between an agency in the executive branch, agency or department, a congressional maybe committee, and then a special interest group where they're lobbying. So again, they're always working hand in hand, whether it's for research, money, votes, ideas, implementation. They are kind of working for each other in that iron triangle relationship. Other executive level departments would be the executive office of the president. These individuals are approved by the Senate. These 4 policy-making areas are very important. National Security Council, again, chaired by the president, other leaders, Joint Chiefs of Staff, CIA, things like that. Then they have the Council of Economic Advisors, approved by the Senate, help with the economic reports. Office of Management and Budget, they prepare the budget, which is very massive and difficult. They kind of direct Congress there, help them. Then the Office of National Drug Control Policy. So again, just kind of looking at the structure there of all the different departments. Some are approved by the Senate, some are not. But looking at the idea that the cabinet has 15 different departments headed by a secretary. The secretaries are appointed by the president. Then they have undersecretaries and deputies and assistants, and they manage all the specific areas and have their own budget. Then there's the regulatory agencies. They're somewhat independent. They act in a manner that is legislative when issuing regulations. So that's quasi-legislative, and then there's quasi-judicial. They act in a manner that is judicial when enforcing penalties. So, they have to follow what legislation is going on, and they act in a judicial manner by enforcing penalties and violations. And a lot of times they're known as the alphabet agencies because you have like the FTC, FDA, FCC, so all those different agencies that regulate different things. And then one of the last big things is congressional oversight, another check on the president and the executive branch. Congressional oversight is the power by Congress to review the operation and budgets of the executive branch, used by Congress to influence and determine public policy. They gather information to form legislation. They review all the budgets. They look at committee. They have committee hearings and investigations, and to bring the need for public policy to the public's attention. So they're trying to bring things up, just make sure the executive branch is operating correctly. So that would be kind of your Unit 2 overview, key concepts there, and how that maybe could be applied in an FRQ. So if you're looking at maybe an example for an FRQ, you can look at bureaucracy, you can look at the different branches. Here's kind of an example of the Senate. So nature of the Senate in American democracy. It says, develop an argument that explains whether the U.S. Senate is a fundamentally democratic or fundamentally undemocratic body. Okay, so you have to have your defensible claim or thesis. The pieces of evidence, they say, use Brutus 1, Federalist 51, or the U.S. Constitution. So the U.S. Constitution would probably be easy to use any of those ideas. And here's a sample response. Again, you are not going to write a rebuttal on this AP test. And then an example of a concept application would be they give you a little article, a little clip or something, then they have ABC. So maybe describing an informal power for this one in the context of that, maybe explaining that power, and then maybe explaining how people are unhappy or how that, and link that to a decision made. So there's a sample response there as well.
I hear silence.
Silence.
That's a good sign.
They're all muted or sleeping. I don't know.
I think we're good.
Yep.
Yep. I heard another yep.
Was that Steven? Was that you?
Sure.
Sure. All right. Anyone sticking around for comparative?
Oh, wait, we do have a question.
Oh, question.
Yeah. What do you expect for us to see the most on the FRQs? Just a pretty good question. I would like to think, obviously, a check and balance on the power of the executive.
Yep.
We have a controversial president. We just had an impeachment process. We had a lot of executive privilege called in.
Mm-hmm.
People refused to testify because of the executive privilege. I wouldn't be shocked if you saw an FRQ on that.
Mm-hmm.
The goal of when they rewrote this course a few years ago, they really wanted to focus on checks and balances. Mm-hmm. So an argumentative essay, it would not shock me if it involved checks and balances on the executive. I got another chat from here. Are we writing 3 FRQs for the exam? Oh, you've answered it.
Yep.
Great. No, just an argumentative and then a concept where they give you this is what you need to know. Answer these questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm really upbeat about these FRQs. I actually think if you guys could put like a solid argument together, you guys might be in good shape.
Yeah, and for that argumentative, you have to use those. Like they give you the 3 things you can use, like required documents or Supreme Court cases. So if you looked over the list, and I think somewhere I have a list of required documents, and there's 15 Supreme Court cases. If you know those and can make this connection, so that's why we talked about the Federalist Papers, talking about the different branches. If you can talk about the Constitution of the United States, they might give you that as a required document. And then you can connect that to separation of powers and checks and balances and bring up one of the Federalist Papers. Then you've kind of done your job using those 2 required documents. They give you 3, you can use 2 of them, or you can also use something else that you've learned in the class. So those kind of required documents in court cases would be very beneficial to kind of rehearse.
And then could you possibly go over like the argumentative essay, like the, I guess, like template or form of it? Because like Mr. Melanis, I know you had it up in your room and like on that poster, but I always forget it.
Oh, so yes. So you want, oh gosh, I'm trying to think about that poster. So you want to write a thesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you want to write a thesis. So they're going to give you a prompt. And by the way, my Zoom's acting all weird right now. Am I like, who are you guys seeing? Mr. Lunkenheimer or me?
I'm seeing everyone because I'm on a different view.
Oh, good. I don't feel weird then. Okay. So you're gonna see like you're gonna see a prompt. You answer the thesis, and when you answer it with a thesis, pick one side. Don't, well, in this case or this case, and then when you write your thesis, make sure the word because is in it, because if you issue a because statement, it means you have to provide reasoning, and reasoning is one of the points that they judge you on. So if they ask you who the greatest superhero is of all time, you would say Batman, because he doesn't have superpowers but can still do great things. And then when you write your argument in the FRQ, make sure you guys use the documents, right? And make sure that you tie those documents then into the thesis, and that will also give you the reasoning point. Mm-hmm. And here's the good news. You guys don't have to write like that last paragraph where you have to refute, rebut, or concede. That's out the door. So really, you just have to use one of the documents, at least one of the documents, to make an argument. Make sure you tie it in with your thesis. You should be good. Mm-hmm. Blunk, anything else?
No, that's good. And then the other portion of it, like not the argumentative, but the other side, the concept application, what it's kind of asking you guys is to, like they're going to present you with some type of scenario, right? So then explain the effects that a political institution, kind of what we just went over today, or behavior or process, you explain that. So being able to explain how a bill becomes a law, or understanding maybe a check like the veto power, being able to explain those things, and then transfer understanding of course concepts and apply them in a new situation. So, how could that affect lawmaking? So maybe the idea of a filibuster, and how could that affect the making a law? Or how could a divided government affect that? So being able to explain those things. So that's the concept application portion, being able to actually just explain and describe. But like Mr. Molina said, for the argumentative is very important, just to have that one side and then support your side with a couple pieces of evidence. Yes, notes are allowed on the test. I would have, some things that you can kind of have available, but you guys, I feel like you don't want to be, sifting through a ton of notes and wasting time there. But you can have those kind of available to you.
Yeah, I mean, having like a one-pager, mm-hmm. like these are my thoughts.
Right.
And if you come across a situation, say on federalism, you got a section right there. Federalism, my go-to. Mm-hmm. Okay. and then you know which part of the Constitution supports federalism. Maybe having the Americans with Disability Act or something there. But I would approach it as, I agree with you. Don't have like 85 pages of notes. It's not going to help you. Or don't print up all the review guides and think that's going to help you.
Right.
A one-page cheat sheet. I don't want to use the word cheat because you're not supposed to cheat, but you guys are allowed to use notes, but keep it simple.
Yeah. I'm going to read an example of maybe an argumentative essay that's kind of talking about bureaucracy in the branches. It says, develop an argument that explains which of the three branches of the federal government, legislative, executive, or judicial, has the greatest connection with the bureaucracy's work and function. So you're kind of making those connections. It says, articulate defensible claim or thesis that responds to the prompt and establishes a line of reasoning. The three documents that you could get there was like Brutus 1, Federalist 10, the U.S. Constitution. You just have to use one of those. Then you can use any other document that you remember, or you can use two of them. So again, just making those connections. Another argumentative essay example could be, develop an argument that explains whether the U.S. Senate is a fundamentally democratic or fundamentally undemocratic body. But then a concept application question where it's more the ABC portion. This one says, the Trump administration unveiled a plan to merge the labor and economic departments into a new Department of Education and the Workforce. The proposal would require congressional approval and is expected to face significant opposition from both Democrats and some Republicans. The sweeping plan builds on Trump's pledge to shrink the size and scope of the federal government. Then it says, after reading the scenario, A, describe an informal power the president could use to promote the plan outlined in the scenario.
Twitter.
Yeah.
Bully Pulpit.
Bully Pulpit right there. B, in the context of the scenario, explain how the use of an executive informal power described in Part A can be affected by the president's interaction with Congress. So if he was using that platform, how does that affect his interaction? And then C, in the context of the scenario, explain how citizens unhappy with the proposal may use linkage institutions to express their displeasure. So linkage institutions, whether it's media, political party, interest groups, how could they kind of use those outlets to affect the scenario? Any other questions on the US test? All right.
All right. Should we do comp?
Let's do comp.
All right. Just want to let you guys know for the east side, I've shared a new chart with you. It's like an updated chart. Make sure you guys take a look at it. Here, let me share my screen. Let's go with... Oh. Can you guys see?
Oh, Chen.
What?
Chen.
That who that is? Is that
okay.
it?
Is this it right here? You guys see this? It's like a big chart.
I can see it.
All right, cool. Yeah, Chen's our hero. So I want to make sure I got the right chart here. It's a big chart, right? The whole trick is use the chart. That's probably your best way because you're comparing and contrasting 6 different countries. So when you compare and contrast 6 different countries, I'm kind of a visual guy, so that's the reason why Mr. Lunkenheimer and I kind of went with this chart. For Unit 2, we're talking about political institutions, and I really got a feeling that Unit 2 is going to be probably where they go, right? It seems to be the most likely, hey, we got to have an argumentative essay. Unit 2's the most material to cover. Let's just go with Unit 2. So we have 3 charts. And the first chart that we're going to look at right here that's on my screen is the parliamentary, presidential, semi-presidential system, term limits, and powers of the executive branch. And they like to point out that, yes, most countries that we study right now are presidential or parliamentary, but you guys should know that one of the countries is a little weird. It's a semi-presidential. That's Russia. They have the combination of the president and the prime minister. Another neat thing about this chart is who's the commander-in-chief of the military, right? Is it going to be the president in every case, or is it going to be the head of state like in the UK? No, it's going to be the head of government. But in some cases, the head of government is in charge. In other states, the head of state is in charge. Very interesting graph. And then the next column is powers of the executive branch. One thing that really kind of scares me is sometimes people mix up the head of state and the head of government.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the United States, we have a president. He's the head of state and government. But in other countries, they actually have separate roles. We start with the UK. They have a head of state. They have a head of government. They got the Queen, and then they got Boris, the guy with incredible hair. Did you guys discuss his hair, Mr. Lunkenheimer?
We did not, no.
Have you seen his hair?
Yeah.
All right. That probably will not be on the test. But other countries that have a divided head of state, head of government, we have the supreme leader and the president. The supreme leader being the head of state, the Iran president being the head of government. And as you all also know, in Russia, we have the president, prime minister. And in China, they have the president, premier, one being the premier being the head of government. But that's a very fascinating country as well. Also, make sure you know in China, for the executive power, the power doesn't flow out of the presidency. It flows out of the party and the general secretary, and then he takes on the role of president. Another interesting part of this chart, the column, term limits. And are they effective? Ironically, some of the countries that have term limits have the most unchecked power going on. Like in the UK, there's no term limits at all, right? The Queen rules until she dies, which, I mean, how old is she now? Like 94?
Mm-hmm.
194? And then for the prime minister, there's no, you can be prime minister as long as you want. That's the most democratic of the AP6 countries that we cover. Other countries that have solid term limits, like Mexico, has a 6-year term limit, so you know. But in Mexico, the Mexican president was almost viewed as a monarchy. Their power was completely unchecked, right? Up until the year 2000, it was one-party rule with the president holding all the power. So other countries that have term limits. Russia has term limits. How does Putin get around it? He changes the constitution, or he becomes prime minister for 4 years. They just announced that they're going to be doing more reforms in the future. And so they really emphasize that term limits don't necessarily mean the giving up of power. Okay? Let's see here. What else is on my screen here? By the way, if you see me looking to the right, it's because I have 2 screens going here.
Nice.
Yeah, I'm living the dream right now. Okay? All right. The second chart is about the legislative branches. Okay. Are they unicameral? Are they bicameral? I also have the makeup, the size. This is the type of stuff you probably just want handy, on the day of the test. Some things that kind of scare me. For instance, I made a mistake already. UK is bicameral.
Oh,
scores. Yeah. In the UK, it's bicameral. It's considered a bicameral. Is it really bicameral? No. It is. It's 2 houses, but one is the House of Commons that does all the business, and then the House of Lords, which is full of a lot of old people who don't do much. Okay, so we definitely got interesting situation there. Iran is unicameral. You might say the Guardian Council, but the Guardian Council serves more as a reviewing body. So it's not considered a legislative body officially. So Nigeria is officially a unicameral. Russia is a lot like the UK. They have a powerful, well, in theory, a more powerful lower house, where the upper house is more of a reviewing body, but they have a little bit more legislative power, so it's considered bicameral. Then looking at the chart, the powers of the legislative branch, pretty straightforward. It tells you, I mean, pretty much any legislative branch is in theory going to approve laws, but you should also know for some authoritarian countries, the legislative branch acts more as a rubber stamp for years under military rule. Nigeria, rubber stamp legislative branch. Iran, you can argue that they don't really have as much power as they wish they had, especially once the Guardian Council vets out most of the moderates. Russia has kind of become a rubber stamp. And then obviously the biggest rubber stamp out there is China, right? The National People's Congress just does whatever the president and the premier want, okay? They are the ultimate rubber stamp. The next column is evidence of constraint on the legislative powers. In the UK, not a lot of constraints, okay? They have parliamentary sovereignty. The House of Lords can delay legislation. They can request amendments, but they can just kind of ignore it. The Queen could refuse to sign a law, but figuring that hasn't happened in 300 years, I don't think that's going to happen in the near future. A lot of presidents can basically veto a law, right? Some presidents, like in Mexico, Nigeria, can issue decrees. All right. So there are a lot of ways that the legislative branch can check the power of the legislative branch. And then there's the next chart is just who's in charge of bureaucracy. It's rather straightforward. Okay. All right. The third chart is going to be the judiciary. This scares me because I didn't really hit the judiciary that hard this year. And it seems like I always seem to focus on the executive and the legislative branch. But hypothetically, they might ask questions about the judiciary. A few things that you should know about the judiciary. There's really two types of law to have. It's common law, like the United States and the UK have, where you use past precedent, past decisions. You have judicial review, where you look at, hey, what, like for instance, say a person's charged with murder. Well, how is the trial going to be handled? You're found guilty. What's the traditional sentence? Okay. The opposite is called code law, or in some cases, civil law. This is where what's happened in the past doesn't really matter. It's what do the statutes specifically spell out? So like in the United States, a law is passed and, it might be 10, 20, 30 pages. Under code law, you have to have every example listed of how to handle a situation. Correct, Claire?
Okay.
Okay. So that is code law. Okay. The other thing you should know is the difference between rule of law and rule by law. Like in the United States, we have rule of law. If the president runs somebody over with his car, it doesn't matter that they're the president, they're charged with the crime, right? Rule of law. If I go to court against someone who's rich, at the end of the day, it's the evidence that matters, right? Not the value of their economics, right? Or their political influence. It's rule of law. We're all under the same rules. Other countries, traditionally authoritarian countries, have rule by law, where we will use the laws to maintain control over you. Great examples of countries with rule by law. China, which has a 90% conviction rating, okay? Nigeria, for years under military rule, right? Ken Saro, who was executed because he went up against Shell Oil for their pollution in the 1990s.
What's your birthday?
Shh, I'm working here, Claire.
What's your birthday?
All right.
Tell me.
So, yeah.
Tell me.
Next.
Okay, I'll just...
Next. Sorry about that. We have in the chart civil society. Oh, next we have, is the court independent? Okay. This is a pretty hard one for me to answer. I think it's probably the hardest question ever. for all of Unit 2. But, I have listed whether their judiciary is independent or not. Some kind of new things that are going on that you might not know about. The UK's Supreme Court just recently told Boris Johnson that he cannot suspend Parliament. So that's an example of the Supreme Court using their independence. Mexico currently is in transition. They are going from written law, code law, to common law, oral arguments, open courts. So that's another example of independence, okay? And then, of course, other countries, there is no independence. Like in Iran, the chief justice appointed by the supreme leader, it's Sharia law. In Russia, Putin picks the judges. He can hire and fire you. In China, the courts are subservient to the Chinese Communist Party, okay? So these are some examples of countries either having independence or not having independence. Next, we're kind of hitting on Unit 3 a little bit earlier, but is there civil society? A country that has strong civil society is traditionally more democratic, more Western liberalization, okay? A country with poor civil society is traditionally authoritarian. Like in the UK, there's freedom of the press, the freedom of non-governmental organizations. There's TV stations, radio stations not controlled by the government. There's political parties, interest groups, unions, freedom of religion, okay? You go to other countries like Iran, right? There's not really freedom of the press. The supreme leader gets to pick editors of the major newspapers. There's not really free TV going on. In Russia, the press is completely, and the media is completely controlled by Putin. Same as China. China has a firewall, right? Try to type in Tiananmen Square on the internet in China, and you get a visit from a bunch of people from the government, okay? In Russia, freedom of religion, ask the Jehovah's Witnesses how that's going. What's the other group that's discriminated against in Russia? Jehovah's Witnesses.
I know like Methodists and like them, they have pressure. They can't like congregate a lot of times unless they're
picked on a lot.
Yeah.
This is going to drive me all night.
Yeah.
Drive me to the wall. Well, anyways, I tried. Jehovah's Witnesses are picked on in Russia. And then finally, we have examples of protection of civil society and examples of regulation on civil society. And you guys can read that chart. It's all very self-explanatory. So I included 2 potential FRQs. I went with the argumentative essay. Now, when you guys take the test, for the AP test, there's going to be 2 questions, right? One's going to be like, here's a chart or a graph, answer the questions A, B, C, D, right? That I think is probably the easiest question ever. You look at the data. So you're going to see something from like Transparency International, the Gini Index, the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. They're going to use one of those organizations to give you a chart, and you're going to chew on it. You're going to take a look at it. You're going to report on the data, and then you're going to have to use some critical thinking about, how one of the AP6 countries, their form of government by what you can guess at by reading the chart. It's pretty straightforward. The next is the argumentative essay. Just like AP US Gov, there is, you write a thesis. And when you write that thesis out, when you're done writing that thesis, write down because and then explain it, right? So that way you get the reasoning. There is no core documents in AP Comparative Government, right? In AP US Gov, you have the Constitution, Brutus number 1. In AP Comparative Government, they have what's called course concepts. So they're going to ask you guys a question here. Let's take a look at argumentative essay number 1. Develop an argument as to whether or not executive term limits can serve as an effective check on the power in authoritarian regimes. And then you have to use one or more of the following course concepts: legitimacy, accountability, or policy implementation. Okay? So you write a thesis, right? A claim. Don't get wishy-washy. No one's going to judge you on the ethics of your answer. Just pick a side, right? So you pick a side, you pick an argument, and then you have to provide two arguments, two pieces of evidences from the AP6 countries. But make sure they involve political legitimacy, accountability, or policy implementation. Those concepts should be used in your argument, okay? So for instance, Mexico, you could easily talk about accountability. Okay, great example. In Mexico, yeah, they have a term limit, but term limits don't really seem to limit the power of authoritarian governments, right? The president has the Sejino. He has a powerful bureaucracy. Because he's only there for 6 years, he doesn't face re-election. He doesn't really have much of an accountability to worry about. It's very hard to impeach the president of Mexico, so I don't think it's ever happened. So boom, there's an argument. You used Mexico. In Russia, you could talk about accountability as well, or political legitimacy of Putin. Okay, that's quite easy. Unit 2, argumentative essay number 2. This is the second one I found here, where you have to, again, develop an argument as to whether judiciary should be independent or dependent on the executive branch for power in authoritarian regimes. And then you have to tie it in with rule by law, legitimacy, and policy implementation. Okay? Again, all you got to do is give a thesis and then provide two arguments. Okay? Does anyone have any questions that I could possibly help you guys with here? I think we're good.
I think we're good.
All right. Is there anything I could do differently to help you guys? Is there anything you guys need?
Do the test for us.
Some ethical questions. Oh, one more thing before you guys leave. Sorry about my daughter. She's being a pain in the butt today.
She's cute.
Oh, yeah. She's adorable for a while. I mean, like, normally you just kind of push them out of the way, but I'm on camera. You really can't do that. All right. You guys have all seen this chart. Is the chart, you think that could help you or not?
Yes, that's really helpful. I feel like that's something that, like, for like notes, I would use that.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you guys need me to print it up, I could probably sneak into East, print it up for you. I think we're still allowed in the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of got to be Kung Fu Ninja, but you can get in there. So I know it's on bigger paper, so if you guys want to print it at home, you just got to kind of mess with the dimensions a little bit, but
Yeah.
just make a copy of it. Again, I didn't want to go over all the chart, but I think the next week, Unit 3, I think it's on civil society and cleavages. But I got a feeling that Unit 2 is really going to be probably what they're going to ask a question on. The other thing you guys probably might not know about, they're kind of long, but you've heard me and Mr. Lunkenheimer talk about Andy. Each of the AP courses has the expert doing YouTube videos, and they're available for you guys. Just type in AP US Government or AP Comparative Government. Mr. Lunkenheimer, who's doing AP US Government?
It's like Jennifer Hitchcock or something. She's really good.
She got out of prison?
No, she's really good.
Nah, I'm just kidding. All right.
Oh.
All right. That's how rumors get started. But Anyways, these guys are doing YouTube videos, and all the AP teachers throughout the U.S. are watching these teachers teach because they're kind of like the experts who write the tests. So if you go to YouTube, just type in, and you can watch them. They're there for you guys. Just type in AP U.S. government or AP comparative government, and it'll have like the AP logo, and they're really, I mean, they're the guys that the teachers look up to, guys and girls that the teachers look up to.
Yep.
So I would also suggest maybe watching a few of those. Maybe I'll provide a link.
Yeah, I put those links on my Schoology page under the test reviews. I just put the whole YouTube. They have like a playlist for each class. So I put each playlist on there.
Just put it on at night, fall asleep to it. You catch the first 30 minutes, you're good to go. Give it a shot. So, okay.
Same time next week.
Same time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.